While Little Women explores a wealth of themes, the debate surrounding who Laurie should have ended up with, that is, childhood love Joe.
No.
It's no use, Joe.
Please
Joe,
don't.
we've got to have it out.
No.
I have loved you ever since I've known you, Joe.
Or newfound love Amy.
You look beautiful. You are beautiful.
Often overshadows its deeper messages. Although it can be fun to debate and pull apart a love triangle, this fixation on romantic pairings ironically misses the radical point Alcott was making in the first place, which is that a woman's value and story are not defined by who she marries. Over the past century, Little Women has been adapted to the screen countless times. So, what makes Gerwig's adaptation so special? In her 2019 adaptation, Greta Gerwig created a more progressive retelling of the story of Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. She arguably finally encapsulates the feminist messages that Alcott had originally weaved into her novel, particularly with regard to female autonomy, and more specifically, autonomy in marriage.
No one. She doesn't marry either of them.
The economy and time in which the March Girls live means that they are required to support themselves somehow, and marriage is the means through which they are socially encouraged to do so.
And you shouldn't go home until you and Fred Vaughan are properly engaged.
In order to become financially independent, they are expected to marry and put all the domestic and emotional skills they spent their childhoods developing together to work for the men around them.
Meg.
As Lara Langer Cohen wrote, as girls, their love is manufactured only for export to enrich the emotional lives of men. In the present timeline, it is Jo who rails against the idea of leaving behind the comfort and warmth of childhood, and the idea that she and her sisters must leave their nest.
Can't believe childhood is over.
For example, Jo is furious when Meg is the first to betray their sisterhood and marry.
You will be bored of him in 2 years, and we will be interesting forever.
According to Cohen, Jo is angry above all because she gets the bitter tragedy of Little Women, as no one else in the novel does. It tells a story about the bonds that knit together a family of women, of love nurtured with exquisite care, only to break up that family and transfer its bonds to an array of frankly disappointing men. But Gerwig does not all demonize marriage. Although our protagonist Jo rejects traditional love, it is at this time that Gerwig introduces the reader to an important idea, the ability to choose.
Just because my dreams are different than yours doesn't mean they're unimportant.
Simply because Jo views marriage as a thief of her freedom and liberty as a woman, that is not to say that every woman who marries like Meg is an opponent to the feminist movement. After all, exactly what feminists are fighting for in the first place is equality and freedom. Freedom to marry or not marry. Freedom to have kids or not have kids. Freedom to have a career or stay home. It really doesn't matter, so long as the woman can choose what she wants to do. Amy sees her circumstances as clearly as Jo does. But unlike Jo, who is a born rule breaker, Amy is a born winner, and so she plans to follow the rules, play the game, and win. She has a more cynical but realistic view on love.
Well, I believe we have some power over who we love. It isn't something that just happens to a person.
She does not have the privilege to view it as the poets do, as a man like Laurie might, because she has given herself the responsibility of marrying the March family out of poverty, the best a woman can do for herself in a world where she has no way of making money independently.
Well, I'm not a poet. I'm just a woman.
Like Jo, she sees the tragedy in marriage, and so of course it's reasonable for her to want to marry into money, because in choosing to marry at all, she realizes she's signing up to give away her freedom, and so she might as well be paid handsomely for it. This mindset does not make Amy cold or unfeeling. Instead, she is someone who has taken a good look at the world in which she lives, and drawn some reasonable conclusions about how to survive in it. This calculated pragmatism is what makes Amy's eventual relationship with Laurie so fascinating, and in many ways inevitable.
Hello there! Are you hurt?
I'm Amy.
Amy left her family a little girl, and grew up during the Europe trip. During this time, she met Fred Vaughan, an aristocrat who met her standards for a suitor, even if she didn't actually love him. In her mind, love was unnecessary for a good match, based on what she thought she valued. When Amy reunites with Laurie, her old romantic feelings for him begin to resurface. Now, both a bit more grown up, Amy sees Laurie as a real potential suitor, one who could equal Fred in her standards, but also have a close emotional connection to. As tensions between herself and Laurie mount, Amy finds that what Fred is offering isn't as valuable as what Laurie could offer her. That is, not only financial security, but also a loving match. Her pragmatic view of marriage starts to shift as she comes to see it as Meg does, as not having to be an oppressive institution, provided the man is truly worthy. And so, in rejecting Fred, Amy chooses this potential with Laurie over the security offered by a match with Fred. For a bit of context, Alcott had originally intended for Little Women to end with Jo unmarried, a literary spinster if you will, much like Alcott herself. However, her publishers insisted that Jo marry, otherwise the book would be unsellable. And so, Alcott invented Friedrich Bär as a, in her words, funny match for Jo.
You're on fire.
Thank you.
You're on fire!
This is where Gerwig's Little Women breaks away from Alcott's original novel. In the final sequence of Gerwig's adaptation, she brings up this same issue of marriage, with Jo's publisher insisting that the protagonist of her book must marry.
If you decide to end your delightful book with your heroine a spinster, no one will buy it.
During this scene, Jo seems to exist in some free-floating liminal space between herself and Alcott. Mirroring Alcott's struggle, after a small back and forth, Jo's publisher remained unmoved, and so Jo agreed, stating,
Well, I suppose marriage has always been an economic proposition, even in fiction.
Echoing Amy's words to Laurie, we are then cut abruptly to Jo running towards Freddie and professing her love to him, sheltered under an umbrella in the pouring rain, the cinematic romance Alcott was forced to give Jo in her novel. What remains ambiguous in the film, however, is whether or not what we just saw actually happened. That is, whether Gerwig's Jo truly married Freddie, or if she just wrote a proposal scene into her novel because she had to. In fact, Gerwig intends for this to remain ambiguous, even writing in the slug lines of the screenplay for those scenes, fiction? In my opinion, it's extremely clear that in Gerwig's version of Little Women, Jo does not marry. Regardless of whether or not you think Jo married though, what is absolutely clear is that ending Little Women with a marriage is an economic choice.